Imagine this for a moment. You walk into your home after a long day, shut the door behind you, and for the first time in years, the silence feels louder than your heartbeat. Not peaceful, not comforting, but confrontational, as if the universe has finally trapped you in a room with the one person you've been avoiding the most, yourself. And in that split second, before you reach for your phone, before you turn on the TV, before you run to anything that keeps you distracted, there's a sudden tremor inside your chest. Because deep down, you know the truth. If you stay silent long enough, something inside you will break or finally begin to heal. Most people never find out which one happens. They run. They drown themselves in noise. They choose the world over themselves every single time. But what if the moment you've been avoiding, the moment that scares you more than heartbreak, more than failure, more than being abandoned, is actually the moment that could change your entire life? What if the silence you fear is the doorway to the version of you you've been searching for all along? This is where the real story begins. Before we dive deeper, if you believe in healing, awakening, and the quiet power of the present moment, please subscribe to Buddhism in every moment to support the channel. Your one click gives us the strength and motivation to continue creating meaningful teachings for your journey. Part 1. The moment you finally stop running from yourself. There comes a moment in every person's life when the noise finally stops. Not because the world has quieted, but because something inside you refuses to keep running. It's rarely dramatic. There is no grand announcement, no sudden enlightenment, no flash of lightning over a mountain peak. Often it begins in the most ordinary places, sitting alone in your parked car after a long day, standing in the kitchen long after the dishes are done, or lying awake in the middle of the night while the city outside falls asleep. But in these unremarkable moments, a truth begins to press against your chest. It whispers, almost imperceptibly, you cannot outrun yourself forever. Most people try. They build entire lives on top of distractions, careers that never end, relationships that never deepen, social circles that never stop expanding, schedules packed so tightly that silence becomes a luxury they can no longer afford. In the modern world, running has become a skill. We run from our thoughts by scrolling endlessly. We run from our fears by staying busy. We run from our insecurities by hiding behind achievements. We run from our past by drowning it in noise. And we run from loneliness by accepting any attention, even the kind that empties us. At first, it feels like protection, but slowly, quietly, it starts to feel like suffocation. What no one tells you is that the most frightening encounter you will ever have is not with another person, not with failure, not with heartbreak, not even with loss. The most terrifying encounter in life is the moment you meet yourself without escape, without distraction, without noise, without performance. The moment you sit in a quiet room and realize that the person you have neglected the longest has been living inside your skin all along. For years, solitude is portrayed as something to fear. Society glorifies crowds, connections, and constant engagement. We're raised to believe that being alone means something is wrong, that we are unlovable, unwanted, or somehow incomplete. But solitude, in its purest form, is not loneliness. It is an introduction. It is the moment you sit across from the deepest parts of yourself and discover that the stranger you've been avoiding is the very soul you've been longing to understand. The beginning of this journey often feels like walking into a room you've avoided for years. You turn the handle slowly, expecting chaos, dust, maybe even ruin. And in some ways, it's true. There are memories scattered across the floor, unhealed wounds sitting on the table, regrets hanging on the walls, unanswered questions leaning in dark corners. But in that same room, there is also light, waiting for you to acknowledge it. There is truth, waiting for you to hear it. There is a quiet sense of familiarity that reminds you, this place has always been yours, even when you pretended it didn't exist. The first time you allow yourself to stop running, you might feel uncomfortable, restless, vulnerable. You might feel an urge to get up, reach for your phone, call someone, open a screen, turn on music, anything to fill the silence that feels too heavy to hold. This reaction is not a sign of weakness. It is a sign of detox. When the mind has been saturated with constant stimulation, stillness feels like withdrawal. Silence becomes a mirror, and mirrors are terrifying when you've spent years avoiding your reflection. But if you sit long enough, something shifts. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the noise within you begins to thin out. The thoughts that once crashed into each other begin to separate. The emotions you pushed away begin to soften. The breath that once felt tight begins to settle. For the first time in a long time, you can hear yourself. Not the version of you shaped by expectation, pressure, or image, but the voice that existed long before the world told you who to be. There is a moment, sometimes after minutes, sometimes after months, when the discomfort begins to fade. And what rises in its place is something astonishingly gentle. A quiet recognition. A sense of returning. A feeling so subtle, yet so profound, that it changes everything. The realization that your own presence can be enough. Not because life suddenly became simple, or because you solved every problem, or because you reached some profound level of wisdom, but because you stopped abandoning yourself. This shift does not happen overnight. Self-abandonment is a long habit, and every habit has roots. You may discover that you've been running from emotions that were too heavy to feel at the time, grief that arrived before you had the tools to carry it, heartbreak that you never fully understood, failures you tried to bury, or truths you weren't ready to face. Solitude is not just the absence of others. It is the presence of your own history. But this time, you're not meeting your past with fear. You're meeting it with compassion. There's a particular kind of magic that emerges when you learn to sit with yourself without judgment. Suddenly, you begin noticing small things, details you overlooked when your life was always loud. The way the morning light falls gently across your living room. The way your breath evens out when you stop forcing it. The way your shoulders slowly relax, as if they've been waiting years for you to exhale. You begin to recognize that your inner world has a rhythm of its own, and that rhythm is not chaotic as you once feared. It's patient, it's steady, it's yours. Truth comes alive in quiet spaces. Not the harsh truth that punishes, but the soft truth that liberates. The truth that says you don't have to be everything for everyone. You don't have to constantly perform to be worthy. You don't have to outrun your feelings to survive them. You don't have to hold your world together alone. You are allowed to rest. You are allowed to begin again. You are allowed to be enough, even here, even now. In cities like New York, where life moves at a speed that can crush the spirit, stillness feels almost rebellious. People rush past each other in a blur, always on their way somewhere else, rarely noticing the quiet river of emotion flowing beneath their own feet. Yet, even there, hidden within the noise, countless individuals are longing for one thing: a moment to breathe. A moment to feel without interruption. A moment to step outside the expectations of the world and step inside their own truth. Solitude becomes that doorway, not an escape, but an arrival. The world often praises those who can multitask, who can push through exhaustion, who can perform under pressure. But rarely do we honor the courage it takes to pause. To turn inwards, to listen, to ask yourself, what is hurting? What is missing? What is calling? What have I abandoned within myself to keep others comfortable? What would my life look like if I stopped running from my own soul? Reflection is not a sign of weakness. It is the birthplace of transformation. And in that quiet place, where the noise dissolves and the performance ends, you may encounter something that feels almost foreign: your own authenticity. A version of you untouched by judgment, comparison, or fear. A version of you that remembers what joy feels like, without needing a witness. A version of you that knows peace not as a concept, but as a living, breathing experience. Sometimes people think they need dramatic life events to awaken them: a breakup, a loss, a collapse, a crisis. But solitude reveals a gentler truth. Awakening can happen softly, through patience, through presence, through the simple willingness to sit with yourself long enough to hear what your heart has been trying to say. Think of a lake after a storm. At first, the water is wild, shaking, splashing, rising. It looks chaotic, broken, impossible to calm. But if left undisturbed, if nothing interferes, if the wind finally stops and the world grows still, the water begins to settle. Slowly, the waves shrink. The surface softens. The clarity returns. The depth becomes visible again. Your mind works the same way. Most people are so afraid to sit with their own internal storm that they never allow it the chance to settle. They shake the water endlessly with distractions, conversations that mean nothing, habits that numb more than they soothe, entertainment they don't even enjoy, relationships they cling to out of fear rather than love. And all of it keeps the mind stirred up, muddy, impossible to see through. But silence, real silence, allows the sediment of the heart to sink to the bottom. It creates the space where clarity rises. Silence forces you to hear the echoes of things unfinished. It brings back the memories you left behind because you weren't ready to handle them. It brings forward every emotion you swallowed for years to keep functioning. It confronts you with the truth that you cannot heal what you refuse to feel. Yet, paradoxically, this confrontation is the beginning of liberation. People misunderstand silence because they confuse it with loneliness. Loneliness is the absence of connection. Silence is the presence of awareness. It is the state where everything false falls away, and everything true is finally allowed to speak. When you stop filling your life with constant sound, you begin to hear a different kind of voice, the one inside you. Not the self-critical voice shaped by comparison. Not the fearful voice shaped by past wounds. Not the ego's voice shaped by insecurity, but the deeper voice that speaks only in truth. The voice that says, "This is who I am. This is what hurts. This is what I need. This is what I long for. This is what I must let go of." Most people spend their lives hearing everyone except themselves. Silence turns the volume down on the world and brings the soul's volume up. There is a moment in deep silence that feels almost sacred. It usually comes after the discomfort, after the restlessness, after the impulse to escape. It comes once you sit long enough that your mind finally surrenders. It comes once you stop trying to control your thoughts and begin witnessing them. And then suddenly the noise inside you slows. The tension loosens. The breath softens. What felt overwhelming becomes more manageable. What felt suffocating becomes spacious. And what once felt impossible becomes clear. Silence gives you back to yourself. Consider the last time you truly heard nothing. Not the hum of traffic, not a podcast playing in the background, not music to fill the static, not a notification tugging at your attention, just silence. For many, that moment happened accidentally. Maybe you were hiking alone in Yosemite and stopped to catch your breath. Maybe you woke up before sunrise in a small cabin somewhere along the Pacific Northwest, the world still asleep around you. Or maybe you simply sat on your porch one evening, the air still, the sky dimming, and for a few seconds you felt something you hadn't felt in years, a quietness inside the quiet. That moment wasn't emptiness. It was fullness. Silence has texture. It has weight. It has presence. It has a way of making you feel like the world is holding its breath with you. And in that shared stillness, you realize something powerful. Life has been trying to reach you, but the noise has been too loud for too long. In Buddhist teachings, silence is considered a doorway to awakening. It is not a punishment, it is a path back to your true nature, which is calm, aware, compassionate, and infinitely wise. When you stop drowning your mind in noise, you begin to hear the subtle truths that guide you toward freedom. You realize that much of your suffering did not come from life itself, but from your resistance to it. You realize that your anxiety often comes from trying to control what cannot be controlled. You realize that your sadness carries messages you have ignored. You realize that your fears are shadows projected by the mind, not monsters waiting to destroy you. Silence reveals these truths not to hurt you, but to liberate you. There is a reason why some of the most profound realizations in life happen in quiet moments. Why people sit beside oceans, at mountaintops, in gardens, in dimly lit rooms, and feel clarity wash over them. It is because silence creates the perfect conditions for wisdom to surface. It slows time long enough for your inner world to be seen, and yet, silence is rarely convenient. It arrives when you are ready, not when you feel prepared. It may come in the aftermath of heartbreak, in the exhaustion of burnout, in the emptiness left by loss, or in the sudden recognition that your life is too loud to hear yourself think. And in these moments, silence does not comfort at first. It confronts. It asks you to sit with the truth that you cannot distract your way out of your pain. It asks you to examine the parts of your life you've been avoiding. It asks you to acknowledge the habits that keep you stuck. It asks you to face the decisions you've postponed. Silence is not passive. It is transformative. It breaks down the walls you built and allows your authentic self to step forward. Most people think they need courage to face the world. But the greatest courage is needed to face yourself. And silence is the environment where that courage grows. Think of someone sitting by the ocean late at night, waves rolling in and out with a rhythm older than memory. They are not speaking. They are not listening to music. They are not filling the moment with distraction. They are simply there, present with nothing between them and their inner world. In that moment, the ocean becomes a mirror. The ebb and flow reflect their own emotional tides, and as they sit quietly, something inside begins to release. Not because the ocean has magic, but because silence creates the space for what is buried to rise. The world tells you that time alone is unproductive, that silence is unhelpful, that you should always be doing something, fixing something, posting something, proving something. But silence tells you the opposite. It tells you that you don't need to earn your existence. It tells you that you don't need to perform to be worthy. It tells you that rest is not laziness. It tells you that reflection is not weakness. It tells you that the world inside you is as real as the world outside. When you embrace silence, you begin noticing things you never saw before. The subtle shifts in your emotions, the patterns in your thinking, the roots of your fears, the origin of your wounds. And with that awareness comes something extraordinary: choice. The choice to respond differently. The choice to stop repeating cycles. The choice to heal rather than hide. The choice to listen rather than run. Silence does not give you answers immediately. It gives you space, and the answers rise within that space. It is not a loud revelation. It is a gentle unfolding. In the quiet, you may realize that the relationship you held onto for years was built on fear, not love. Or that the job you've been chasing was more about approval than purpose. Or that the person you've become is not the person you want to continue being. Silence does not judge you for these truths. It simply shows them to you so you can choose better. Healing through silence is not about erasing what happened. It is about feeling what you could not feel at the time. It is about acknowledging the parts of you that were neglected. It is about giving yourself the grace to be human. Silence becomes the ground where compassion grows, not only for others, but for yourself. Slowly, the resistance you once felt toward silence fades. You begin craving it. It becomes a refuge rather than a threat. You start turning off your phone more often. You start sitting with your morning coffee without reaching for entertainment. You start driving without music. You start walking without needing something to distract you. You begin trusting that silence is not taking something from you, but giving something back. You realize that silence is not the absence of life. It is the doorway into a deeper life, one where you can hear yourself breathe, feel your own heartbeat, and connect with something larger than your mind's constant chatter. Silence becomes a companion, a teacher, a friend. And through this friendship, you begin to understand that healing does not come from forcing your way through pain. Healing comes from listening. Listening to the mind without believing every thought. Listening to the heart without fearing its vulnerability. listening to the soul without rushing its timing. Silence teaches you that you don't need answers right away. You don't need closure instantly. You don't need direction immediately. Sometimes you simply need space to feel, space to breathe, space to unravel, space to rediscover the parts of yourself that were buried beneath years of noise. You discover that the void you once feared is not a void at all. It is a field of possibility. It is a place where intuition grows, where clarity reveals itself, where truth stops hiding, where healing begins without permission and continues without pressure. In the end, silence becomes the healing you didn't know you were missing. It becomes the medicine the world could not offer. It becomes the sanctuary where you learn not just who you are, but who you are capable of becoming. And once you taste the peace that rises from true quiet, you never forget it. It becomes an anchor, a reminder, a home, because silence, when embraced, does not take you away from life. It brings you back to it. Part 3, Solitude, brings you back to what truly matters. There comes a time in life when the weight of everything you've been carrying begins to feel heavier than it should. Not because the load suddenly increased, but because you finally stopped long enough to feel its true weight. In the busy rhythm of modern living, checking boxes, answering messages, showing up for others, doing what is expected, you can go years without realizing that your life has been shaped far more by noise than by intention. It's only when the world quiets, only when you find yourself truly alone, that the deeper truth begins to rise. You've been living so fast you forgot what you were living for. Solitude is not a step back from life. It is a step inward. It pulls you out of the whirlwind long enough to ask questions that rarely surface when the world is loud. What truly matters to me? What feels authentic? What have I been chasing without ever stopping to understand why? What parts of my life feel heavy and which parts feel like home? These questions don't appear in a rush. They emerge slowly, like the way dawn spreads across the horizon of the Grand Canyon, soft at first, then unmistakably clear. When you're alone, without the constant buzz of responsibilities and social expectations, you begin to hear yourself think in a way that feels foreign but strangely familiar, like returning to a childhood home you haven't visited in decades. The walls may feel different, the air older, the layout slightly unfamiliar, but something in you whispers, "I remember this." Life has a way of pulling you away from your center. You start out with simple dreams, simple joys, simple truths. But somewhere along the way, you absorb the world's expectations: be more, have more, prove more, appear more. You learn to measure your worth by external markers: success, money, relationships, status, productivity. You learn to chase goals that look impressive rather than meaningful. You convince yourself that fulfillment is something you earn, not something you cultivate. And in this relentless pursuit, you become disconnected from the quiet, steady pulse of your own inner life. Solitude is where the reconnection begins. When everything around you slows, when the noise fades, when there's no one left to perform for, the truth becomes impossible to ignore. You start to notice what drains you. You start to see the relationships that have been held together only by habit. You recognize the goals that don't actually belong to you. You feel the fatigue that you've been suppressing under layers of distraction. You begin to see the difference between what is essential and what is merely loud. And strangely, that realization does not break you, it opens you. There is something powerful about sitting in a quiet room or taking a long walk without purpose, letting your mind wander where it naturally wants to go. These moments reveal patterns you couldn't see when you were rushing. They reveal truths you couldn't hear when the world was shouting. They reveal needs you ignored because staying busy was easier than being honest. Solitude places your life in front of you like a map. Suddenly, the roads you've been walking out of habit no longer feel automatic. You can see where each road leads. You can decide whether you want to continue. You can choose a different direction. But perhaps the most transformative realization that solitude brings is this: your life should feel like your own. Many people do not realize that they've been living according to borrowed dreams, dreams handed to them by parents, society, culture, or comparison. You may have chosen a profession because someone once told you it was stable. You may have stayed in a relationship because you feared what people would think if you left. You may have pretended to enjoy certain things because the people around you celebrated them. You may have silenced parts of your personality because they didn't fit the image you were expected to maintain. Little by little, you drift away from yourself. Solitude brings you back. In the stillness, the mask becomes too heavy to hold. The roles you've been playing begin to unravel. The expectations you've been trying to live up to suddenly feel hollow. You start asking questions you didn't know you were allowed to ask. Who would I be if I stopped trying to be who everyone expected? What would I choose if no one were watching? What dreams are truly mine? These are not small questions. They are life-altering questions. And solitude is the only environment where they can breathe. If you've ever stood on the cliffs of Big Sur, watching the waves crash relentlessly into the shoreline below, you know the feeling of being reminded of what is timeless. Solitude works the same way. It strips away the unnecessary until only the essential remains. You see your life from above, the way you see the coastline from those cliffs. Patterns become clear. Priorities reorder themselves. Distractions fall away. What once seemed important now reveals itself as fragile, fleeting, or shallow. And what you had forgotten, the sweetness of small things, the joy of being present, the calm of a slow breath, the quiet satisfaction of doing something simply because it fills your soul, returns to you with surprising force. People often misunderstand solitude as a withdrawal from the world. But the irony is that solitude is what allows you to re-enter the world more whole. It removes the filter of urgency and comparison. It sharpens your awareness of what matters. It anchors you in purpose rather than pressure. And when you step back into your life from that place, everything feels different, not because your circumstances have changed, but because you have. This inner alignment is not something you force. It is something you discover. Think of a forest that has been untouched for years. No manicured paths. No artificial arrangement. Just nature growing in the way it was meant to grow. Solitude allows your inner life to do the same. When you stop trimming yourself to fit into the expectations of others, your natural growth begins to show. You rediscover passions you abandoned. You remember boundaries you never enforced. You feel desires that were buried beneath exhaustion. And slowly, like a forest awakening after winter, your inner world begins to stretch, to breathe, to reclaim space. There is a profound difference between a life that looks good and a life that feels good. Most people spend years chasing the former and wake up one day realizing they missed the latter entirely. Solitude confronts you with this difference. It shows you where you have been choosing image over fulfillment, speed over meaning, productivity over presence. It holds up a mirror and asks you the question that changes everything. Does this life reflect what matters to you? You can't lie to yourself in silence. That's what makes it powerful. Consider how many decisions you've made because you felt pressured by time. How many choices were made to avoid discomfort. How many paths you followed simply because they were already there. Solitude interrupts this autopilot. It reintroduces intentionality. It creates distance between you and the world long enough for you to see your life clearly. And in that clarity, you begin to recognize the difference between living and merely existing. Many people spend their days rushing toward a future they haven't defined, hoping that someday everything will make sense. But solitude reveals that clarity is not something you find in the future. It is something you reclaim in the present. You don't discover what matters by adding more to your life. You discover it by subtracting what doesn't. This is why restaurants with panoramic views of Lake Michigan feel different when you sit alone. Not because being alone is sad, but because you taste your food more deeply, you see the light differently, you breathe slower. You are present in a way that is impossible when your mind is divided. Presence is not a luxury, it is a necessity. And solitude is the birthplace of presence. When you start to pay attention, you notice that life is filled with moments that whisper truth, but you've been too busy to listen. the way sunlight crawls across the floor, the sound of your footsteps echoing in an empty hallway, the warmth of your own breath on a cold morning. These moments are not trivial. They are invitations, reminders that meaning does not only exist in extraordinary events, but in the ordinary ones you overlook. Solitude heightens your sensitivity to these details. It deepens your appreciation of life as it is, rather than what you think it should be. It reminds you that you are not separate from the world, you are woven into it. Slowly, your priorities shift. Not because you forced them to, but because solitude allowed you to see clearly. You start craving depth instead of distraction, peace instead of noise, connection instead of validation, purpose instead of approval. The external world becomes less of a dictator and more of a landscape you move through with intention. Eventually, you stop chasing the things you never wanted. You stop saying yes to obligations that drain you. You stop apologizing for needing space. You stop attaching your worth to your productivity. You stop mistaking motion for progress. You stop running from yourself. And in that stopping, in that quiet, in that profound return to your own center, something beautiful happens. You discover what truly matters. Not the things you've been told to want, but the things your soul has been reaching for all along: peace, clarity, presence, purpose, truth. Solitude does not give you these things. It reminds you they were never gone. What changes your life is not the absence of people. What changes your life is the presence of yourself. Part 4. You become your own best friend. There is a moment in the journey of solitude that arrives softly, almost quietly, as if it's been walking behind you for years, and finally chooses to tap you on the shoulder. It happens not when you expect it, not when you think you're ready, but when you've spent enough time alone to notice something subtle but life-altering. You no longer feel uncomfortable in your own company. The silence that once felt heavy starts to feel like a familiar blanket. The space that once felt echoing now feels spacious. The presence you once avoided now feels like home. This is the moment when you realize you are learning how to become your own best friend. It doesn't happen in a single hour, or a single day, or after a single meditation session. It happens slowly, through hundreds of small, almost invisible shifts in the way you relate to yourself. It happens through the tone of your inner dialogue, through the way you respond to your mistakes, through the way you comfort yourself after disappointment, through the way you pause, breathe, and listen instead of rushing to judgment. Becoming your own best friend is less about what you do and more about the way you begin to treat your inner world with gentleness, presence, and respect. Most people have never truly met themselves. They know their accomplishments, their roles, their labels, their mistakes, but they do not know the tender, deeper layers beneath all of that. The world rarely teaches you how to cultivate this bond. It does not praise people for sitting quietly with their emotions. It does not celebrate those who choose authenticity over performance. It does not reward those who honor their limits, protect their energy, or speak to themselves with compassion. Instead, the world teaches you how to become everyone else's supporter, caregiver, problem solver, entertainer, therapist, anchor, everything, it seems, except your own ally. But when solitude stretches long enough, when silence grows familiar enough, and when you finally stop running from the parts of yourself you once ignored, you start noticing that something within you begins to soften. You start treating yourself differently. You start showing up for yourself, the way you always hoped someone else would. It begins with awareness. You notice the tone of your inner voice, maybe for the first time. Not just what it says, but how it says it. You notice how harshly you judge yourself for the smallest things: forgetting a deadline, gaining a little weight, saying something awkward, or not being as perfect as you imagined you should be. You notice the impatience, the frustration, the criticism you direct inward without hesitation, even while being gentle with everyone else. In that awareness, something new emerges: choice. You begin asking yourself, why do I speak to myself this way? Why do I treat myself as if I am unworthy of tenderness? What would my life feel like if I talked to myself the way I talk to someone I love? Slowly, Almost imperceptibly, you begin changing the way you respond to your own pain. Instead of berating yourself when you're overwhelmed, you pause. You place a hand on your chest. You breathe. You tell yourself, it's okay. I'm here. Words you may never have heard from others now come from within, and they carry a power that surprises you. Because when compassion comes from your own voice, it reaches places no external comfort ever could. Becoming your own best friend is not about isolation. It's about inner belonging. It is the moment you realize you no longer abandon yourself during painful moments. You no longer disappear when you need yourself most. You no longer look outward desperately, hoping someone else will save you, validate you, or give you what you never learned to give yourself. Instead, you turn inward, and for the first time in your life, you find presence, your own presence waiting. One of the most striking parts of this transformation is how your relationship with discomfort changes. When you are your own best friend, discomfort stops being a threat. It becomes an opportunity. Instead of fleeing your anxiety, you sit with it. Instead of numbing your sadness, you listen to it. Instead of rejecting your fear, you honor it. You begin to understand that emotions are not enemies, they are messages. And when you finally make space for them, they stop controlling you. This is where true inner strength is born, not through avoidance, but through companionship with yourself. In solitude, you discover an emotional resilience that cannot be shaken by circumstances. The world teaches you to fear being alone with your feelings, but solitude teaches you the opposite, that being alone with your emotions is where you learn how to navigate them. You learn to breathe through them. You learn to let them rise and fall naturally. You learn to differentiate between emotions that are passing and stories you've been carrying for years. Every time you choose to stay with yourself instead of escaping, you reinforce a truth that reshapes your whole inner landscape. You are not fragile. You are not unworthy. You are not broken. You are human, and being human comes with waves. Waves that can be met, understood, and eventually softened. As this relationship deepens, you start creating small rituals that strengthen your bond with yourself. These rituals aren't grand or dramatic. They are ordinary moments transformed by intention. Waking up 10 minutes earlier to sit in silence. Taking a quiet walk without your phone. Writing your thoughts in a journal without filtering them. Drinking tea slowly and consciously. Pausing halfway through your day to check in with your body. These small acts become threads, and eventually, those threads weave a sense of inner safety you've never felt before. When you become your own best friend, you begin giving yourself permission to rest without guilt, permission to say no without explanation, permission to choose what nourishes you rather than what impresses others. You begin making choices based on alignment rather than approval. You stop overextending yourself to gain acceptance. You stop tolerating relationships that drain you. You stop betraying your boundaries for the sake of convenience. It's astonishing how many burdens begin to fall away when you choose yourself with loyalty. There is a moment, usually unexpected, when you feel an internal shift so deep it almost startles you. It happens while you're doing something simple, folding laundry, watering a plant, sitting in traffic, and suddenly you realize, I am not lonely. I am at peace. What used to feel like emptiness now feels like fullness. What used to feel like silence now feels like companionship. Your own presence becomes enough, not as a consolation prize, but as something rich, nourishing, and complete. This is when life begins expanding from the inside out. When you are no longer fighting yourself, you have more energy to invest in living. When you stop judging yourself, you have more clarity to make aligned choices. When you stop abandoning yourself emotionally, every aspect of your life begins to stabilize. You no longer cling to others out of fear. You no longer chase relationships to fill a void. You no longer use productivity as proof of worth. You stop living a life that runs on external validation because internal validation has finally taken root. And something beautiful happens. You become a safer place for yourself than the world has ever been. Becoming your own best friend transforms the way you treat your needs. You no longer see them as inconveniences. You see them as instructions. You honor them. If you need rest, you rest. If you need solitude, you take space. If you need connection, you reach out mindfully. If you need change, you begin the process. You understand that your needs are not weaknesses, they are truths. And when you honor your own truths consistently, you begin to build trust with yourself. That trust becomes the foundation of your inner home. It becomes the reason you no longer fear uncertainty, because you know you will not abandon yourself through it. It becomes the reason you no longer fear heartbreak, because you know you will hold yourself gently through the pain. It becomes the reason you no longer fear judgment, because your worth no longer depends on public approval. When you become your own best friend, you stop negotiating your worth. Your life begins to feel like it belongs to you, your choices, your boundaries, your joys, your quiet mornings, your healing, your growth. You realize that the relationship you've been searching for, the one where you feel understood, held, supported, and seen, can only begin when you offer those things to yourself first. This kind of self-friendship is not selfish. It is essential. It is the soil in which every other aspect of your life grows. When you treat yourself with compassion, your relationships become healthier. When you validate yourself from within, your ambitions become clearer. When you trust yourself, your decisions become stronger. When you love yourself, your life becomes more expansive. And just when you believe you've learned everything solitude had to teach you, a deeper lesson emerges. The world cannot offer you the sense of belonging you refuse to give yourself. Belonging begins internally. It begins the moment you say, "I am here for myself." It begins the moment you choose to embrace the parts of you that once made you uncomfortable. It begins the moment you stop waiting for others to rescue you and start rescuing yourself. In the end, becoming your own best friend is not an accomplishment. It is becoming a soft unfolding, a slow remembering, a gentle returning to the truth that has always lived beneath the noise. You are worthy of the same compassion, care, and devotion that you so freely give to others. And when that truth finally anchors in your heart, solitude no longer feels like being alone. It feels like being accompanied by someone who understands you better than anyone ever could yourself. Part 5: Emotional Independence. The liberation you didn't know you needed. There is a kind of freedom that does not come from changing your circumstances, earning more money, meeting the right person, or finally feeling understood by the world. It is quieter than all of that, more intimate, more enduring. It is the freedom that arises when you stop depending on someone else to regulate your emotions. The moment you stop outsourcing your peace. The moment you stop tying your self-worth to how others respond to you. That freedom, emotional independence, is one of the most sacred forms of liberation a human being can experience. Yet most people never reach it because they don't know they need it. Emotional dependence is so deeply woven into our culture that it feels natural. You're taught from childhood to look to others for comfort, affirmation, reassurance, and identity. You grow up believing that your happiness is something the world can give or take away. You learn to measure your emotional safety based on someone else's approval. And for years, without realizing it, you allow your sense of worth to be handed back to you in pieces through compliments, attention, affection, or validation. It feels normal until the day it doesn't. Until the day you realize that relying on someone else to soothe your storms leaves you powerless the moment they leave, withdraw, or simply cannot be who you need them to be. Emotional dependence is a fragile way to live. It keeps you constantly adjusting yourself, constantly proving yourself, constantly bending your own truth to hold on to something that was never meant to carry the weight of your entire heart. But solitude changes all of that. Solitude exposes the parts of you that cling, not because you are weak, but because you have never been shown another way. When you are alone without distraction, without someone else's voice to drown out your thoughts, you begin to notice the emotional patterns you've been living inside for years. You notice how easily your mood shifts based on someone else's opinion. You notice how deeply your anxiety spikes when you feel ignored. You notice how quickly you internalize other people's reactions. You notice the ways you shrink yourself just to avoid disappointment. And you begin to realize that much of your suffering comes not from life itself, but from how tightly you have tied your emotional stability to forces beyond your control. Emotional dependence creates a life of constant fear of rejection, fear of abandonment, fear of disappointing others, fear of being alone. But emotional independence dissolves that fear from the inside out. It teaches you that the one person who can never abandon you is yourself. And once that truth takes root, your entire emotional landscape begins to shift. This shift does not happen overnight. It is a slow and often uncomfortable unlearning. You begin to see how much of your identity was built around trying to be needed, trying to be wanted, trying to be accepted. You see how often you said yes, while your entire being was begging to say no. You see how many times you stayed in situations that drained you simply because leaving felt too frightening. You see how often you kept quiet just to maintain peace. Emotional dependence teaches you to abandon yourself for the comfort of others. Emotional independence teaches you to return to yourself, no matter who stays or leaves. It begins with awareness, the kind of awareness that solitude forces upon you. When you sit alone long enough, without the emotional noise of other people's expectations, you start recognizing which emotions are truly yours and which ones you've been borrowing. You start noticing the difference between the discomfort of growth and the discomfort of self-betrayal. You start seeing your emotional life not as something that happens to you, but as something you can participate in consciously. Once awareness arrives, compassion follows. Compassion for the younger version of you who never learned how to self-soothe. Compassion for the version of you who clung to people because you didn't know how to hold yourself. Compassion for the version of you who thought that needing others to feel whole was the same thing as love. Emotional independence does not begin with strength. It begins with compassion, the permission to forgive yourself for not knowing what you didn't know. With time, you begin practicing a different way of relating to your emotions. Instead of looking outward when something hurts, you start looking inward. When anxiety rises, you place a hand on your chest and breathe. When sadness comes, you allow yourself to feel without asking someone else to fix it. When fear shows up, you notice it without letting it dictate your choices. You begin to trust that you can hold your emotions without collapsing under them. You begin to trust that you can comfort yourself. You begin to trust that your inner world is navigable. Emotional independence is not emotional isolation. It is not shutting people out or pretending you don't need connection. It is the recognition that you can receive love without being dependent on it, and you can stand alone without being disconnected. It is the ability to let people come and go without losing your sense of self. It is the ability to feel deeply without drowning. It is the ability to care without clinging. It is the ability to open your heart while keeping your center anchored. You begin to understand that peace is not something someone else gives you. Peace is something you learn to cultivate from within. And the more you practice this inner anchoring, the less reactive you become to the world. You stop overthinking every text message. You stop seeking constant reassurance. You stop interpreting silence as rejection. You stop letting instability in others create instability in you. There is a moment, a powerful, unmistakable moment when you realize that the emotional storms you once feared no longer terrify you. You begin responding rather than reacting. You begin observing rather than absorbing. You begin choosing rather than clinging. You begin feeling without unraveling. And in that moment, you understand the difference between depending on others and connecting with others. Connection becomes a choice, not a survival mechanism. Somewhere along this path, you start to notice your boundaries strengthening. Not because you became harder, but because you became kinder to yourself. You learn that saying no is an act of self-respect, not rejection. You learn that protecting your energy is not selfish but necessary. You learn that you are allowed to choose relationships that nourish you rather than drain you. And as your boundaries strengthen, so does your sense of self-worth. One of the most profound revelations of emotional independence is how it transforms your relationships. When you no longer depend on someone else to make you feel whole, you stop placing unrealistic expectations on them. You stop trying to control them. You stop demanding that they fill the voids inside you. You start loving freely, without desperation, without fear. You begin to attract relationships based on authenticity rather than need. And if someone cannot meet you with respect, consistency, or care, you quietly walk away, not because you don't care, but because you care about yourself too. Emotional independence sharpens your discernment. You begin to see clearly who adds to your life and who only adds noise. You no longer confuse intensity with intimacy. You no longer mistake attention for affection. You no longer romanticize inconsistency. You no longer settle for relationships that require you to abandon yourself. Slowly, your emotional world becomes calmer. The highs are no longer dizzying, and the lows no longer feel catastrophic. You begin living in the middle space, the space where peace lives, where clarity grows, where groundedness becomes natural. You stop needing chaos to feel alive. You stop needing drama to feel significant. You stop needing external validation to feel seen. And then, one day, you experience a moment that reveals just how far you've come. Maybe it happens when someone doesn't text you back. Maybe it happens when someone disappoints you. Maybe it happens when life throws you a curveball. Maybe it happens when loneliness brushes past you. In the past, moments like these would have sent you into emotional turbulence. But now, something is different. You feel the emotion rise, you breathe through it, and you return to yourself. No panic, no spiraling, no desperation. Just presence. This is emotional independence. This is the freedom you didn't know you were capable of. This is the liberation you didn't know you were missing. It is the moment you realize you are no longer controlled by your emotions. Instead, you are guided by them. You listen to them, honor them, and allow them to move through you, but you no longer let them dictate your worth or your choices. You have become your own anchor in a world that never stops shifting. And in that groundedness, a deeper truth reveals itself. Love becomes richer, deeper, freer. Because now when you love someone, it comes from abundance, not need. It comes from clarity, not fear. It comes from choice, not desperation. Emotional independence allows you to love as a whole person, not as a fragment seeking completion. This is the quiet revolution that solitude brings, the revolution of learning to hold yourself. The revolution of learning to trust yourself. The revolution of becoming emotionally free in a world that profits from your insecurity. And once you taste this freedom, there is no going back. Not because you reject connection, but because you finally understand that the foundation of every connection is the relationship you have with yourself. Emotional independence is not the absence of emotion. It is the mastery of presence within emotion. It is the return of your power. It is the beginning of inner peace. And from this peace, everything else in your life begins to bloom. Part 6: Solitude awakens your creativity, awareness, and inner vision. There is a kind of awakening that only happens when the noise finally dies down, an awakening so subtle that many people pass through life without ever touching it. It is the awakening of creativity, intuition, and the quiet inner sight that is impossible to access when the mind is constantly pulled into the world's chaos. In solitude, this awakening rises like the first light over a mountain ridge, gentle, slow, unmistakable. It does not arrive with fireworks, it arrives with clarity. Most people don't realize how much creativity is buried beneath their distractions. It isn't that they lack ideas. It's that their ideas are drowned out before they have the chance to breathe. Noise kills creativity more efficiently than failure. It crowds the mind until there's no space left for inspiration to land. In a world where everything demands your attention, the inner voice becomes the first casualty. But solitude gives that voice back to you. When you sit alone long enough for your mind to settle, long enough for the surface-level thoughts to exhaust themselves, something deeper begins to rise. It often comes in the form of a spark, a whisper, a subtle pull, a memory that suddenly feels meaningful, a question that lingers without explanation, an idea that appears so unexpectedly it feels almost like a gift delivered by something beyond the rational mind. This is the beginning of creative consciousness. This is the doorway to inner vision. Creativity does not emerge from pressure. It emerges from presence. It emerges when there is spaciousness around your thoughts, when the mind is not cluttered with tasks, fears, deadlines, and noise. Solitude creates this spaciousness. It opens the door to the parts of yourself that have been waiting for you to slow down long enough to hear them. You begin noticing things you once rushed past. The shape of a shadow on your wall, the way wind slips through an open window, the color of twilight settling across the sky, the rhythm of your own breath. These details, seemingly insignificant in the busyness of life, become sources of inspiration when your mind is calm enough to observe them. Creativity grows in the soil of attention. In solitude, attention becomes a form of devotion. You begin devoting attention to the world within and around you. This heightened awareness does not feel forced. It feels natural, like rediscovering a sense you forgot you had. Your mind begins making connections with ease. Your thoughts flow in directions you didn't consciously choose. Your imagination, once dulled by routine, begins to move freely again. You become curious about your own inner landscape. You begin to ask questions not out of fear, but out of wonder. This is one of the greatest gifts solitude offers: curiosity without judgment. In the presence of others, creativity often collapses under the weight of expectations, fear of being wrong, fear of being misunderstood, fear of appearing foolish. But when you are alone, these fears lose their power. You are no longer performing. You are exploring. You are no longer seeking approval. You are seeking understanding. You begin seeing yourself as an unfolding rather than a finished product. The mind becomes a playground rather than a prison. And in this playground, something remarkable happens. Intuition awakens. Not the fleeting hunches that come from anxiety or doubt, but the deep, steady knowing that rises when you stop interfering with your own truth. Intuition is not mysterious. Intuition is the mind in its clearest state. When the mind is free from noise, free from attachment, free from external influence, it begins telling you things you already knew but had forgotten. It reveals what aligns with you and what doesn't. It shows you where your energy flows naturally. It guides you toward the choices that reflect your inner nature rather than your conditioned habits. Solitude sharpens this inner compass. It helps you hear the difference between fear and instinct, between desire and distraction, between your true calling and the expectations of others. Ideas begin to surface that you didn't know were waiting. Stories unfold within you that you didn't realize you were carrying. Solutions appear that once felt impossible to reach. What you once forced through effort now flows through clarity. This is not magic. This is the mind unburdened. In silence, your brain enters a different mode, a contemplative, imaginative, free-flowing state that modern life rarely allows. Psychologists call it the default mode network, but ancient teachings have known it for centuries. Buddhists call it the natural mind, the effortless awareness that arises when you stop grasping and start observing. In this state, inspiration arrives like a quiet visitor, not with noise, but with truth. You may find yourself remembering childhood dreams that felt impossible in adulthood. You may feel drawn to creative pursuits you abandoned years ago because life became too heavy. You may rediscover passions that once lit your soul but were buried beneath obligation. You may feel urges to write, paint, build, explore, create, not for recognition but for expression. The creative impulse is not childish. It is sacred. Creativity is the language of the inner self. It is how your soul speaks when the world isn't listening. When you give yourself space to create without expectation, you begin reconnecting with parts of yourself that were never meant to disappear. You rediscover your inner child, not in a naive way but in a pure way. The part of you that once played freely begins to breathe again. The part of you that once imagined impossible worlds begins to open. The part of you that once felt wonder at ordinary things begins to stir. Solitude does not erase responsibility. It reveals possibility. You begin recognizing that imagination is not separate from your real life. It is the seed of every meaningful change. Every invention, every book, every movement, every breakthrough began as a quiet thought in someone's solitary mind. The world is shaped by people who were willing to sit with themselves long enough to hear ideas no one else could hear. Solitude connects you to that lineage of inner thinkers and inner seers. And yet, the awakening that solitude brings is not only creative, it is deeply perceptive. Awareness expands when you are no longer pulled in 10 directions at once. You begin to see the world not as a series of tasks, but as a series of truths. You notice subtle emotions you once ignored. You hear under the surface of conversations. You see beneath the appearances people project. Your perception becomes sharper, more intuitive, more grounded. This heightened awareness changes the way you move through life. You stop reacting impulsively. You start responding with clarity. You stop engaging in unnecessary drama. You start choosing environments that nourish you. You stop distracting yourself with noise. You start listening to the quiet intelligence of your inner world. In the quiet, your vision for your life begins to take shape. Not the vision others gave you, but the vision you discover when the world's expectations fade. You begin imagining a life that reflects your values, your truth, your rhythm. You begin seeing pathways that once seemed unreachable. You begin understanding what you truly want, not what looks good, not what gains applause, not what follows the script, but what brings you alive. This inner vision is not a fantasy. It is the blueprint your soul has been carrying for years. When you stop drowning your intuition with distraction, the blueprint finally rises to the surface. In the presence of others, creativity often collapses under the weight of expectations, fear of being wrong, fear of being misunderstood, fear of appearing foolish. But when you are alone, these fears lose their power. You are no longer performing. You are exploring. You are no longer seeking approval. You are seeking understanding. You begin seeing yourself as an unfolding rather than a finished product. The mind becomes a playground rather than a prison. And in this playground, something remarkable happens. Intuition awakens. Not the fleeting hunches that come from anxiety or doubt, but the deep, steady knowing that rises when you stop interfering with your own truth. Intuition is not mysterious. Intuition is the mind in its clearest state. When the mind is free from noise, free from attachment, free from external influence, it begins telling you things you already knew but had forgotten. It reveals what aligns with you and what doesn't. It shows you where your energy flows naturally. It guides you toward the choices that reflect your inner nature rather than your conditioned habits. Solitude sharpens this inner compass. It helps you hear the difference between fear and instinct, between desire and distraction, between your true calling and the expectations of others. Ideas begin to surface that you didn't know were waiting. Stories unfold within you that you didn't realize you were carrying. Solutions appear that once felt impossible to reach. What you once forced through effort now flows through clarity. This is not magic. This is the mind unburdened. In silence, your brain enters a different mode, a contemplative, imaginative, free-flowing state that modern life rarely allows. Psychologists call it the default mode network, but ancient teachings have known it for centuries. Buddhists call it the natural mind, the effortless awareness that arises when you stop grasping and start observing. In this state, inspiration arrives like a quiet visitor, not with noise, but with truth. You may find yourself remembering childhood dreams that felt impossible in adulthood. You may feel drawn to creative pursuits you abandoned years ago because life became too heavy. You may rediscover passions that once lit your soul but were buried beneath obligation. You may feel urges to write, paint, build, explore, create not for recognition but for expression. The creative impulse is not childish. It is sacred. Creativity is the language of the inner self. It is how your soul speaks when the world isn't listening. When you give yourself space to create without expectation, You begin reconnecting with parts of yourself that were never meant to disappear. You rediscover your inner child, not in a naive way, but in a pure way. The part of you that once played freely begins to breathe again. The part of you that once imagined impossible worlds begins to open. The part of you that once felt wonder at ordinary things begins to stir. Solitude does not erase responsibility. It reveals possibility. You begin recognizing that imagination is not separate from your real life. It is the seed of every meaningful change. Every invention, every book, every movement, every breakthrough began as a quiet thought in someone's solitary mind. The world is shaped by people who were willing to sit with themselves long enough to hear ideas no one else could hear. Solitude connects you to that lineage of inner thinkers and inner seers. And yet, the awakening that solitude brings is not only creative, it is deeply perceptive. Awareness expands when you are no longer pulled in 10 directions at once. You begin to see the world not as a series of tasks, but as a series of truths. You notice subtle emotions you once ignored. You hear under the surface of conversations. You see beneath the appearances people project. Your perception becomes sharper, more intuitive, more grounded. This heightened awareness changes the way you move through life. You stop reacting impulsively. You start responding with clarity. You stop engaging in unnecessary drama. You start choosing environments that nourish you. You stop distracting yourself with noise. You start listening to the quiet intelligence of your inner world. In the quiet, your vision for your life begins to take shape. Not the vision others gave you, but the vision you discover when the world's expectations fade. You begin imagining a life that reflects your values, your truth, your rhythm. You begin seeing pathways that once seemed unreachable. You begin understanding what you truly want, not what looks good, not what gains applause, not what follows the script, but what brings you alive. This inner vision is not a fantasy. It is the blueprint your soul has been carrying for years. When you stop drowning your intuition with distraction, the blueprint finally rises to the surface. You may find yourself feeling grateful for no particular reason. You may notice joy in things you've overlooked: sunlight on your skin, the sound of distant laughter, the taste of warm food, the softness of your own breath. You begin to realize that happiness has always been accessible in moments like these, but you were too preoccupied, too overstimulated, too externally focused to receive it. Your relationship with life changes. You stop expecting life to deliver happiness to you like a package on your doorstep. You begin taking responsibility for nurturing your own internal ecosystem. And once you do, you understand why external happiness always felt temporary. It was never meant to sustain you. It was meant to guide you inward. Solitude reveals that much of your suffering came not from events, but from interpretations. Not from emotions, but from resistance to them. Not from loneliness, but from the belief that you were incomplete alone. When you drop these beliefs, something inside you settles. You begin to forgive yourself more easily. You begin to forgive others more willingly. You begin to trust that you can survive the waves that once frightened you. Peace no longer feels like an ornament, it feels like your nature. Calm no longer feels unfamiliar, it feels like home. And the more time you spend in this inner space, the more you realize how little you need in order to feel whole. Not because you are detaching from life, but because you are reconnecting with what is essential. When you stop needing life to be extraordinary, you begin to experience the quiet miracle of simply being alive. You find beauty in the mundane, not because the mundane becomes extraordinary, but because you do. Your awareness sharpens. Your heart softens. Your perspective expands. You begin to see that meaning was never hidden. It was overshadowed by noise. People often believe that happiness comes when life finally comes together, when the chaos settles, when the perfect moment arrives. But solitude teaches you that happiness does not need permission from your circumstances. It does not wait for better days. It does not require healing to be complete. Happiness is woven into the fabric of the present moment. It is your awareness that has been torn. The beautiful truth is this: nothing in your life needs to change for you to feel happier. Your relationship with your own mind is what needs to change. You begin asking yourself different questions, gentler questions. What small thing today brought me peace? What moment made me smile without anyone noticing? What emotion did I honor instead of suppress? What choice did I make that aligned with my truth? These questions nurture the inner soil where happiness grows. Not the happiness that sparkles for a moment, but the kind that stays. As this inner transformation deepens, you start differentiating between pleasure and peace. Pleasure is immediate, intense, fleeting. Peace is steady, subtle, enduring. Pleasure comes from stimulation. Peace comes from presence. Pleasure ends quickly. Peace lingers. Pleasures make life enjoyable. Peace makes life livable. For years you confused the two. Solitude teaches you the difference. And once you feel peace, even for a single breath, you realize that happiness was never what you thought it was. It is not excitement. It is not perfection. It is not the absence of difficulty. It is the presence of yourself. It is the moment you stop bargaining with life. It is the moment you stop postponing joy. It is the moment you stop believing that something is missing. It is the moment you start inhabiting your life fully. We live in a culture obsessed with improving oneself. But solitude reveals a radical truth: there is nothing fundamentally wrong with you. You do not need to be fixed, you need to be found. And the person you are searching for is not gone. They are buried under layers of noise, fear, conditioning, and distraction. Solitude is the unearthing. As you uncover this deeper self, you may feel something warm rising in your chest, a tenderness, a familiarity, a sense of returning. This is the heart recognizing its own reflection. This is happiness recognizing itself within you. You may realize that you have spent most of your life looking outward for answers that only existed inward. And that realization, though bittersweet, feels incredibly freeing. You no longer feel pressured to live a life that impresses others. You begin living a life that nurtures you. External achievements still matter, but they no longer define you. Relationships still matter, but they no longer complete you. Success still matters, but it no longer controls you. You are no longer searching for happiness. You are cultivating awareness. And awareness, like sunlight, allows everything it touches to grow. There is a moment unmistakable when you understand the fullness of the truth. Happiness was not outside you. It was inside, waiting for you to open the door. This realization changes the way you look at your past. You stop seeing your struggles as proof of inadequacy and start seeing them as the very path that led you inward. You stop regretting your mistakes because you understand they were stepping stones. You stop resenting the time you spent lost because it was part of learning how to find yourself. Happiness becomes less of a destination and more of a companion. It walks with you, even on difficult days. Even when you feel tired. Even when life is uncertain. Because happiness is no longer something you are trying to maintain. It is something you are resting in. You begin choosing simplicity over complexity. Not because life becomes smaller, but because your awareness becomes deeper. You begin recognizing that joy is not something you chase, it is something you allow. Like a soft flame, it grows when you stop shielding it with fear. You stop needing constant reassurance from the world because the world inside you feels enough. You stop fearing quiet moments because they feel like sanctuary. You stop searching for yourself in other people because you finally feel the truth of your own presence. And in the heart of this transformation lies the most beautiful truth of all: happiness does not arrive. It is revealed. It does not depend on what happens. It depends on how awake you are to what is happening. It does not bloom in perfect circumstances. It blooms in conscious presence. You begin understanding that happiness is not found in the extraordinary, but in the deeply ordinary moments where you are fully alive. The sound of rain on your window. The warmth of sunlight across your face. The breath that rises and falls without effort. The quiet moment before sleep. The stillness of a morning before the world wakes. These are not small things. They are life, real life. Happiness stops being something you pursue and becomes something you return to. When you realize that happiness lives within you, you stop negotiating your life with conditions. You stop postponing joy. You stop waiting for the perfect moment. You stop believing that life must be flawless for you to feel at peace. You understand that happiness is not found in controlling life, but in releasing it, trusting that the deeper currents of your being know where to take you. And in that surrender, the truth becomes impossible to ignore. Happiness was never missing. You were simply too far from yourself to feel it. But now, after all the quiet, after all the solitude, after all the returning, you can finally sense it. Steady, warm, present, not loud, not fleeting, but yours. Part 8. Returning to the present moment. Where life actually happens, there comes a point in the inward journey where you begin to notice something subtle, yet profoundly life-altering. You are rarely ever fully present. Even in solitude, even in silence, even when the world around you is still, your mind continues to scatter into memories, into fears, into imagined futures, into unresolved questions, into everything except the only place you truly live, the present moment. It's almost startling once you see it clearly. How often your body is here, but your mind is somewhere else. How often an entire afternoon disappears, not because it was filled with meaning, but because you were lost in a stream of thoughts you didn't choose. How often you experience a moment but don't feel it. How often life passes not by days or events, but by unconsciousness. Solitude makes this truth impossible to ignore. When the world quiets, the noise inside your mind becomes unmistakable. And it is in this tension, in the gap between presence and distraction, that you begin to understand how much of your suffering comes not from life itself, but from your absence within your own life. Most people live in two places: yesterday and someday. They replay conversations, rethink mistakes, resurrect old wounds, or worry about a future that has not yet unfolded. They live in anticipation or regret, in longing or avoidance, in what was or what might be. But life, real life, does not happen in memory or imagination. It happens in the space between breath and breath. The present moment is the only place where you can truly experience anything. And yet, it is the place we inhabit the least. Solitude teaches you how to return. At first, the present moment feels almost inaccessible. Your mind resists it. You reach for awareness and your thoughts pull you away. You try to focus on your breath, and your mind distracts you with a dozen small anxieties. You try to sit still, and your mind begins listing everything you need to do, everything you forgot, everything you might fail at. This is normal. The mind is not your enemy, it is simply untrained. It has spent years running wild, moving restlessly between past and future, constantly searching for stimulation, distraction, or certainty. Training the mind to return to the present is like calming a wild animal, not through force, but through patience. Little by little, through quiet moments and gentle awareness, you begin to learn the art of returning. Returning to your breath. Returning to your senses. Returning to the feeling of your feet on the ground, the sound of wind against your window, the rise and fall of your chest. Returning to this moment not because it is perfect, but because it is real. There is a profound peace available only in the present moment. Peace that does not depend on success or stability. Peace that does not depend on answers or guarantees. Peace that does not require life to look a certain way. It is the peace of simply being here without running, without past, without future. It is not the absence of thought, but the absence of struggle. Not the absence of emotion, but the absence of resistance. Presence makes space for everything. It allows life to unfold rather than forcing it. The more time you spend in solitude, the more you begin noticing the small miracles that presence reveals. You notice the way morning light rests on your wall like a soft blessing. You notice the crispness of cold air entering your lungs on a winter walk. You notice the quiet hum of your refrigerator in the middle of the night, a sound you've heard 1,000 times but never really listened to. You notice the curve of steam rising from a cup of coffee. You notice the sound of your own heartbeat in moments of stillness. These are not insignificant details. They are the sensory anchors that pull you out of the mind and back into life. Presence gives you back the world. Somewhere along the way, you begin to understand that the present moment is not empty, it is overflowing. It holds everything you've been searching for: peace, clarity, grounding, connection, wisdom. The difficulty is not that the present moment lacks meaning, it is that you have been too distracted to feel it. When you learn to return over and over again, you discover that every moment is layered with textures you once missed. The sound of waves hitting the shore is not one sound, but many. The scent of pine trees in a quiet forest is not simple, but complex. The softness of your own breath is not something automatic, but something sacred. The warmth of sunlight on your skin is not just temperature, but presence. The world reveals itself differently when you stop rushing past it. And just as the world becomes richer, so does your inner life. You begin noticing emotional truths in real time, not hours later when the moment has passed, not years later when the memory resurfaces, but here, now, as it unfolds. You recognize the moment your heart tightens. You notice the moment your mind begins to spiral. You sense the moment a boundary is crossed. You feel the moment a truth rises inside you. Presence is emotional intelligence in its purest form. It lets you respond to life instead of reacting to it. It lets you see what a moment requires rather than what your fears demand. It allows you to choose your actions rather than being carried away by your habits. It shows you that most suffering is not inherent to the experience, it is created by your resistance to it. When you are present with pain, pain moves. When you are present with confusion, clarity begins to emerge. When you are present with fear, fear loosens its grip. Presence does not eliminate difficulty, but it transforms your relationship with it. Instead of drowning, you float. Instead of fighting, you observe. Instead of collapsing, you breathe. And slowly, presence begins to rewire your life. You stop rushing. You stop multitasking your way through existence. You stop filling silence with noise. You stop living life on autopilot. You start savoring. You start listening. You start noticing the people you love more deeply. You start seeing yourself more clearly. You start finding meaning in what you once overlooked. Presence is not a technique, it is a way of living. It changes the way you eat, the way you walk, the way you speak, the way you rest. You begin to enjoy small things, not because they suddenly become extraordinary, but because you finally stop missing them. You begin to feel grateful not because life becomes easier, but because you become more awake to its subtle gifts. You begin to feel more alive not because life changes, but because you change. And within this shift lies a deeper truth. The present moment is the only moment where life is happening. Everything else exists only in the mind. The past is a memory shaped by perception, softened by time, colored by emotion. The future is an imagination shaped by fear, by hope, by possibility. The present is the only place where you can touch reality. Once you understand this, you stop postponing your life. You stop waiting for the perfect moment. You stop believing that you will be happier once things get better. You stop telling yourself that peace is on the other side of achievement. You stop living in mental time travel and begin inhabiting your life fully. Life becomes less about chasing certainty and more about embracing presence. Less about controlling and more about experiencing. Less about achieving and more about being. Perhaps the most profound shift of all is this: you begin to feel safe in the present moment. For many people, being present feels vulnerable. It means facing yourself without distraction. It means feeling without avoidance. It means letting go of the illusion of control. But the more you return, the more you realize that the present moment is not a threat, it is the safest place you can be. It is the only place where life is happening in real time. The only place where you can navigate with truth rather than fear. The only place where anxiety cannot survive because anxiety lives in the future. The only place where regret cannot thrive because regret lives in the past. Presence neutralizes suffering because it takes you out of the stories your mind creates and brings you back into the reality of the moment, which is almost always manageable. You begin to understand why so many ancient teachings emphasize the now, not because the present moment is glamorous or dramatic, but because it is real. It is honest. It is direct. It is alive. It is where you rediscover your breathing, where you feel your heartbeat, where you return to yourself. Presence is the ultimate form of coming home. As you deepen into this practice of returning, something else begins to unfold in awareness that the present moment is not only a personal refuge, but a gateway to a more compassionate life. When you are present with yourself, you become present with others. You listen more deeply. You understand more fully. You judge less quickly. You react less harshly. You empathize more naturally. Presence softens your relationships because it softens your inner world. It brings humanity back to your interactions. It brings patience back to your conversations. It brings sincerity back to your connections. The more present you become, the more you realize something extraordinary. Life is not rushing past you. You have simply been absent from it. And the moment you return, life rushes back in all its beauty, all its mystery, all its fragility, all its truth. The present moment is not a place you visit. It is where you belong. It is where your power lives. It is where your peace begins. It is where your life unfolds. And every time you return, you awaken a little more. You soften a little more. You grow a little more. You become a little more alive. The present moment is not waiting for you to be perfect. It is waiting for you to be here. Part 9: Hearing your inner calling and building a life true to yourself. There is a turning point in every person's inner journey, a moment when everything that once felt distant suddenly becomes unmistakably clear. You cannot keep living a life that does not feel like yours. You cannot keep ignoring the quiet truth inside you. You cannot keep following paths that suffocate your spirit, no matter how logical or socially acceptable they appear. And you cannot keep betraying the voice within you just to avoid disappointing the world around you. At some point, often after a long stretch of solitude and quiet introspection, you begin to hear something deeper. Not a thought, not a fear, not a desire shaped by comparison, but a calling. The inner calling does not shout. It whispers. It always whispers. It speaks in subtle ways, through moments of discomfort, through a persistent tug in the chest, through an unexplained longing, through the sense that something essential is missing, even when your life looks complete from the outside. It speaks through your exhaustion, your dreams, your frustrations, your intuition, and your restlessness. It speaks every time you feel alive. It speaks every time you feel disconnected. It speaks when you pause. It speaks when you suffer. It speaks when you breathe. The calling is always there. You've simply been too distracted to hear it. Most people spend the first half of their lives following directions written by other hands. You follow the script handed to you by society, by family, by culture, by expectation. You pursue careers that feel respectable rather than purposeful. You stay in relationships that feel familiar rather than nourishing. You choose routines that anesthetize rather than awaken. You build a life based on what you believe you're supposed to want, not on what genuinely resonates with your inner truth. For a while, this works. You can live a long time without listening to yourself. But eventually, sometimes slowly, sometimes suddenly, your inner world begins to protest. The discomfort becomes louder. The dissatisfaction becomes harder to ignore. The emptiness becomes impossible to fill with distractions. And the small voice within you begins to rise, insisting that something must change. This voice is not demanding a perfect life. It is demanding an authentic one. At first, the calling may scare you. It feels uncertain. It threatens the stability of the life you've carefully built. It asks questions that dismantle the comfortable illusions you've lived inside for years. What if the life you've built is not your own? What if the dreams you chase are borrowed? What if the identity you wear is a costume? What if the future you're walking toward does not reflect who you truly are? These questions are difficult not because they are wrong, but because they are true. Solitude amplifies this truth. In the quiet, you can no longer hide. In the quiet, everything false falls away. In the quiet, the calling grows louder. It is in those moments, those evenings when you're sitting alone after a long day, Those mornings when you feel an inexplicable heaviness, those long walks where your mind drifts into honesty, you begin to feel something awakening, a stirring, a knowing, a sense that you've outgrown a version of yourself you once needed for survival, but no longer need for growth. You begin to see how much of your life was built on fear of judgment, fear of failure, fear of disappointing others, fear of uncertainty. You begin to see how often you said yes when every part of your body wanted to say no. You begin to see the difference between what is familiar and what is aligned. You begin to see the cost of abandoning yourself to maintain a life that never truly belonged to you. Hearing your inner calling is not about hearing a voice. It is about hearing the truth you have been avoiding. It often comes in the form of clarity, a sudden realization of what no longer fits, a sharp understanding of what drains you, a painful recognition of what must be released, a peaceful acceptance of what is over, and an undeniable pull toward what feels right, even if it scares you, even if it makes no sense to anyone else, even if you cannot explain it. Your calling does not require external approval. It requires internal honesty. Once you begin listening, your life begins rearranging itself. Sometimes in small ways, sometimes in drastic ways. You may find yourself shifting priorities, spending less time on what feels empty and more time on what feels nourishing. You may find yourself letting go of relationships that no longer support your truth. You may find yourself simplifying, slowing down, making space for what matters. You may find yourself drawn to experiences that awaken rather than distract. Your calling flows in the direction of what makes you feel alive. Aliveness is the compass. You feel it in your chest. You feel it in your breath. You feel it in your bones. You feel it in the moments when time disappears. The calling does not always lead to dramatic changes. Sometimes it leads to subtle but powerful shifts within you. You begin showing up differently. You begin choosing differently. You begin speaking differently. You begin honoring yourself differently. You begin creating a life that feels more intentional, more aligned, more honest. And once you begin building a life that reflects your inner truth, something extraordinary happens. Peace returns. Not the fragile peace that requires circumstances to be perfect, but the deep peace that comes from living authentically. The peace that comes from knowing you are not betraying yourself. But building a life true to yourself is not easy. It demands courage, vulnerability, and commitment. It requires letting go of the identities you've outgrown. It requires accepting that not everyone will understand your transformation. It requires choosing alignment over approval again and again. Some people may question your choices. Some may resist your growth. Some may drift away as you step into a more authentic version of yourself. But the relationships that remain, the ones that survive your evolution, become deeper, truer, more meaningful than anything held together by convenience or fear. Authenticity filters your life. It removes what is shallow and reveals what is real. The life you begin building is not perfect. It is honest. And honesty gives birth to joy that cannot be stolen, shaken, or faked. You start making decisions based not on fear, but on resonance, not on obligation, but on intention, not on habit, but on truth. You begin asking different questions. What do I need today? What feels aligned? What brings me peace? What expands me? What steals my energy? What makes me feel alive? These questions are guideposts. They lead you toward a life that grows from your deepest values rather than external expectations. And as your inner calling becomes clearer, you begin seeing that purpose is not something you find, it is something you uncover. Purpose is not a single path. It is a way of being. It is the alignment between who you are and how you live. Your calling may guide you toward new creative pursuits, new spiritual practices, new connections, new forms of expression. Or it may simply guide you toward a quieter, more grounded way of existing, one where you do less but feel more, one where you achieve less but live more deeply. You realize that the life you once imagined for yourself was limited by what you knew at the time. But the life you are building now is shaped by who you are becoming. This is the essence of living true to yourself. letting your inner truth shape your outer life. Not the life you were taught to want. Not the life you performed for others. Not the life you clung to out of fear, but the life that feels like home. There is a profound power in this realization. You stop trying to control the path. You begin trusting the pull. You begin surrendering to the intelligence within you. Not passively, but with awareness, with the understanding that your inner calling is not random. It is not delusional. It is not reckless. It is the compass of your soul. Every time you ignore it, you feel lost. Every time you follow it, you feel found. Your calling does not promise certainty. It promises authenticity. And authenticity is worth every unknown. As you build a life true to yourself, you begin to feel anchored, not because life becomes predictable, but because you become aligned. You begin to feel free not because everything is easy, but because you are no longer carrying the weight of pretending. You begin to feel alive, not because your life is perfect, but because it finally feels like yours. The most beautiful part of this transformation is that your life begins to expand in ways you could never have predicted. When you live in alignment, you attract opportunities that resonate with your truth. You draw in people who recognize your authenticity. You find yourself in the right places at the right time, not because of luck, but because you are no longer resisting your own path. The calling within you becomes a quiet rhythm guiding the way. A pulse that leads you where you belong. A truth that shapes the life you were meant to live. And one day, almost without realizing it, you discover something extraordinary. You are no longer searching. You are following. You are listening. You are living. Your life begins feeling less like something happening to you, and more like something unfolding through you. And in that unfolding, you find what so many spend their lives chasing, but never finding a life that is honest, aligned, meaningful, grounded, peaceful, and unmistakably your own. Part 10: The Quiet Rebirth Life. After coming home to yourself, there comes a moment in every inward journey when everything begins to shift, not in loud, dramatic ways, but in quiet, unmistakable ones. It happens not when you finally fix your life, not when you obtain some perfect version of yourself, not when the world applauds your transformation, but in the simple moment when you realize you have come home. Home to your breath. Home to your truth. Home to your presence. Home to the quiet strength that was waiting beneath the noise all along. This is the quiet rebirth. It is not the beginning of a new life. It is the beginning of living your real one. After all the solitude, the inner work, the letting go, the grieving, the awakening, the returning, you find yourself different. Not because life itself changed dramatically, but because you changed in the way you meet life. For the first time, you begin living from wholeness rather than hunger, from inner alignment rather than fear, from groundedness rather than survival. You begin to understand that the person you were before was doing the best they could with the tools they had. You do not judge that version of yourself anymore. You do not shame them for not knowing what they know now. Instead, you hold them with compassion, because they carried you for years without rest. They walked roads of confusion and loneliness, so that the present you could walk roads of clarity and peace. This is the gentle truth of rebirth. Every former version of you is part of your becoming. When you come home to yourself, life begins unfolding differently. You wake up with a softness in your chest that wasn't there before. The mornings feel less rushed, the evenings less heavy. You no longer feel the pressure to fill every quiet moment with distraction. Silence becomes a companion rather than a threat. Stillness becomes nourishment rather than punishment. You begin moving slower not because you are less driven, but because you are no longer driven by fear. You begin speaking more gently not because you are trying to be perfect, but because you are at peace. You begin choosing with intention, listening with presence, and acting with clarity. Decisions that once caused anxiety now feel manageable. Problems that once overwhelmed you lose their power. You begin to trust your timing. You begin to trust your intuition. You begin to trust life. The rebirth is not loud. It does not require a dramatic announcement or a reinvention that others must witness. It is a shift felt internally, in the places where external achievements cannot reach. You begin noticing the places inside you that no longer hurt the way they used to. The triggers that once sent you spiraling now dissipate with a breath. The insecurities that once controlled you now dissolve under the light of awareness. And perhaps the most astonishing part of this rebirth is the emotional neutrality that begins to settle into your life. Not numbness, not indifference, but balance. A quiet steadiness that holds you through joy and sorrow, through ease and challenge, through certainty and uncertainty. You begin to understand that peace is not a destination, it is a practice. It is the act of returning to yourself over and over again. The more you live from this place of inner rootedness, the more you realize that life does not require perfection. It requires presence. You no longer chase happiness like a distant dream. You feel it in the simplest things. In the warmth of sunlight on your arm. In the taste of water after a long day. In the sound of your own breath. In the quiet moments when nothing is happening, and yet everything feels complete. You no longer confuse peace with stagnation. You no longer confuse chaos with meaning. You no longer confuse noise with connection. You no longer confuse validation with love. Your heart becomes quieter, but your life becomes fuller. Rebirth also transforms your relationship with others. You no longer cling to relationships out of fear. You no longer tolerate disrespect. You no longer abandon your boundaries. You no longer shrink yourself to fit someone else's expectations. Instead, you show up as you are. You speak honestly, love intentionally, connect authentically, and let go gracefully. You begin attracting people who resonate with your truth, not your performance. These relationships feel different, lighter, deeper, calmer. They feel like conversations where you don't have to hide, moments where you don't have to pretend, connections where you don't have to earn your place. You realize that the more you come home to yourself, the more you create space for people who belong in your life to find you. And at the same time, you are no longer afraid of being alone. Solitude becomes a sanctuary that supports your growth rather than a void you fear. You feel whole even without company, fulfilled without constant stimulation, grounded even on quiet nights when the world is asleep. You stop filling emptiness with people. You fill it with presence. Part of rebirth is understanding that not everything is meant to stay, and that is not a tragedy. It is a natural part of becoming. You begin releasing with grace. You stop chasing after what no longer aligns. You stop trying to reopen doors that life has gently closed. You stop feeling obligated to remain in versions of yourself you've already outgrown. You stop holding your breath, waiting for something outside you to change. You exhale. You soften. You trust. This is the wisdom of someone who has come home to themselves. You stop resisting life, and life stops feeling like a battle. The rebirth becomes visible in the smallest places. You start noticing the beauty in ordinary moments. You give yourself permission to rest. You stop apologizing for taking up space. You stop fearing change. You move with intention, not urgency. You speak with clarity, not defensiveness. You hold yourself with compassion, not criticism. You let life be simple where it can be simple, and you navigate complexity with presence rather than panic. You realize that peace was never the absence of problems, it was the presence of yourself. The world may not change when you come home to yourself, but the way you experience the world does. And that is enough to transform everything. Rebirth is not a single moment. It is a continuous softening, a continuous remembering, a continuous returning. It is the gentle recognition that the person you are becoming is someone you once believed you could never be, someone calm, grounded, clear, present, self-loving, and internally guided. Someone who does not need chaos to feel alive. Someone who does not need approval to feel worthy. Someone who does not need to run to feel safe. Someone who does not hide from themselves. You become the person you once desperately needed. And perhaps the most beautiful part of this journey is the realization that you are no longer searching for yourself, you have found yourself. Not the polished, idealized version you once imagined, not the flawless version of your unhealed dreams, But the real you, the one who breathes with intention, feels with courage, chooses with honesty, and lives with compassion. You begin living your life not from fear, but from alignment. Not from pressure, but from authenticity. Not from confusion, but from clarity. Not from longing, but from fullness. The rebirth becomes a quiet promise you make to yourself to never abandon yourself again, to never silence your truth, to never run from your own presence, to never choose external comfort over internal peace. You understand now that home was never a place, a person, or a milestone. Home was always a state of being. And now, after everything, after the noise, after the searching, after the unlearning, after the awakening, you are finally here. You have come home. Again and again and again. And this time, you are staying. When you step back and look at the entire journey we've just traveled, from the first moment you stopped running from yourself, to the stillness that revealed your inner world, to the awakening of creativity, intuition, emotional independence, happiness, presence, and finally your quiet rebirth, you begin to see a pattern. A truth that was always there, waiting beneath the noise. Everything you were searching for in the outside world already lived within you. The peace you longed for, the clarity you craved, the strength you doubted you had, the love you kept hoping someone else would give you, the sense of belonging that always felt just out of reach. All of it was rooted in the simple, overlooked act of turning inward. Solitude was not a punishment, it was the doorway. Silence was not emptiness, it was healing. Being alone was not abandonment, it was alignment. Every moment you once feared became the very moment you needed to meet the parts of yourself you had forgotten. This journey was never about escaping the world, it was about returning to yourself so fully that the world could no longer shake you. You learned that happiness is not something you chase, but something you allow. That clarity comes not from answers, but from presence. That emotional independence is not loneliness, but liberation. That creativity is not a talent reserved for a few, but the natural expression of a mind finally free from noise. You learn that the life you were searching for begins only when you stop living for others and start listening to your own inner calling. And in the quiet rebirth that followed, you discovered a deeper truth. Peace does not come from perfect circumstances. It comes from coming home again and again to who you really are. When you live in alignment with your inner truth, life softens, not because challenges disappear, but because you finally meet them from a place of groundedness instead of fear. You stop running. You stop pretending. You stop abandoning yourself. And in doing so, you plant the seeds for a life that feels honest, meaningful, and unmistakably your own. This is the gift of the entire journey, the realization that you are not missing anything. You are remembering everything. The deep lesson, the deepest lesson, this story teaches is simple yet life-changing. Your inner world determines the quality of your entire life. When you are disconnected from yourself, no amount of success, love, or validation will feel like enough. But when you are rooted in presence, truth, and self-friendship, even the simplest moments become extraordinary. How to apply IT in daily life? Start small. Create daily pockets of silence. Sit with your emotions instead of running from them. Choose one truthful action each day, something aligned with your real values, not your fears. Practice grounding breaths when your mind wanders. Ask yourself often, does this feel like me? Does this honor who I am becoming? Build tiny rituals that bring you back home to yourself, again and again. Over time, these small acts create a life that feels intentional, peaceful, and deeply your own. After hearing this journey, what part resonates with you the most? Which chapter reflects where you are in your own life right now? What truth in this message touched you personally? Share your thoughts in the comments, so others can learn from your perspective. And if you found value in this message, please subscribe to Buddhism in every moment to support the channel and inspire us to continue creating more meaningful content for you. Your presence means more than you know.